Welcome, curious minds. Our mission today is, well, a pretty critical one. We're going to try and unravel this really intricate tapestry of U.S. foreign policy,
hmm
especially how it gets shaped and sometimes challenged, particularly in the Middle East.
Right.
We want to explore those, profound influences and sometimes surprising shifts that impact American decisions on these major global conflicts. And we've gathered some really revealing accounts for you, stuff that gives a unique perspective, someone who was right there inside.
And that's exactly it. This isn't just about skimming headlines. It's more about connecting the dots, really, giving you, the listener, a clearer, more nuanced picture of the forces at play.
Okay.
We'll be looking at insights that, well, they often stay hidden, helping you understand the complex drivers behind the news you see every day.
That sets things up perfectly for our first area of exploration, which is the human element in all this policy stuff. We learned something particularly compelling right at the start, the story of disillusionment from a former insider. What really struck you about Dr. Annel Rodriguez Shalen's experience, her decision, to leave the U.S. State Department back in March 2024?
Well, what's immediately striking is her commitment, and then eventually her sense of despair. Dr. Shalen was specifically working on human rights.
Right, under Biden.
Under the Biden administration, yes. And her departure came about 6 months after October 7th. She joined, hoping to make a real difference. And look, she definitely tried.
Yeah.
We see she co-authored a dissent cable that's basically an official internal way for diplomats to formally disagree with policy, and she signed others. She was involved in various internal efforts trying to convey this widespread horror many inside felt about the U.S. stance.
So she wasn't passive. She was actively trying to shift things from the inside.
Absolutely.
Yet she still felt she had to resign. Publicly, what does that act, coming from someone in a human rights role, tell us about how immovable that policy seemed?
That action, which is, a very public and significant step for a diplomat, it reveals something critical. Her realization, it seems, that this particular policy was just deeply dug in. And being driven right from the White House, it really highlights a stark gap between, say, stated values and what actually happens on the ground, policy-wise.
And she names names, doesn't she?
She does. She points at President Biden himself as being quite committed to it, along with key people like Brett McGurk, he's the White House coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor.
Okay.
And maybe the most striking mention is Samantha Power, the head of USAI, someone who literally built her career calling out genocide and government inaction.
Right.
Yet these figures were reportedly all committed to this policy. So the overwhelming feeling from Dr. Shalen's viewpoint was that, and this is her perspective, very little or nothing is having any impact to change America's unconditional support for Israel's genocide. That's a powerful statement about how impermeable the policy felt, even against strong internal pushback.
Building on that stark insider view, it gets really intriguing when we zoom out a bit. Look at the history of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. The accounts we looked at suggest a pretty major shift, contrasting how things used to be perceived with, well, today's reality. Historically, the State Department sometimes got labeled Arabist, right? Implying maybe a bias towards, or at least an understanding of, the Arab world.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But now, what are these contemporary views suggesting? You mentioned insights from someone like Alan Duncan, a former British Foreign Office minister. Has that perceived leaning disappeared? And what's taken its place?
That Arabist label is, a fascinating historical note.
Right.
But the landscape clearly shifted. What we've gathered points to a view now where, as Alan Duncan suggests, Israel wields significant control. He even thinks they control the British Foreign Office.
Wow.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, America's sustained presence, its policy in the Middle East, it goes back pretty much as long as Israel itself has existed. Sure, there's the somewhat tired justification about oil.
Always oil.
Always oil. But the accounts we explored really highlight that a lot of U.S. involvement have long been, and still is, about supporting Israel.
Okay.
And this directly reflects, the power of the Israel lobby and also the political influence of Christian Zionists. It's this deep, deep connection shaping policy right at the top.
So less about traditional national interests, as we might think of them, and more about these powerful kind of embedded influences.
Exactly.
Can you give us a concrete example? How does this vice-like grip, as it's described, actually show up?
Absolutely. The materials point to President Biden's own very long relationship with Israel, a connection so deep, he famously said in the Senate years ago, if Israel didn't exist, America would have to invent it.
I remember that quote.
Right. And this profound connection, the accounts suggest, can even lead to what people see as unfulfilled promises. For example, in Dearborn, Michigan, people who met Biden during the campaign were reportedly told there'd be a big change, that he'd end the war in Gaza. But the suggestion is that turned out to be, and the word used was, a crock, leading to pretty significant disillusionment among some voters. It just underlines how enduring, almost unshakable these factors are on policy, even when facing domestic political heat.
Given everything we've just discussed about these deep influences, it becomes really eye-opening to look at the comparisons are
Right.
What surprising parallels maybe the urgency of ceasefire efforts in Gaza across different regions?
Well, initially there was apparently some excitement around Trump's approach because he reportedly imposed a ceasefire in Gaza quite early on.
Okay.
And this, according to some analyses we saw, simply demonstrated that Biden had never actually used any American leverage, despite, all the claims about working tirelessly for a ceasefire.
So Trump's actions suggested the leverage was there all along.
That's the implication, yeah,
Yeah.
even if it was temporary. And beyond Gaza, Trump also took steps that reportedly went against the preferences of Netanyahu and the Israeli government.
Like what?
For instance, signing a ceasefire deal with the Houthis, which helped get the U.S. out of what was called a costly campaign, billions spent under Biden, it noted. He also normalized relations with Syria and significantly started direct talks with the Iranians about their nuclear program. So this led to some initial hope, maybe, that Trump might forge a Middle East policy more driven by purely American interests.
But then, you said initial, it sounds like that didn't last. That facade, as you called it, of diverging from Netanyahu, it came crashing down.
It seems so.
What was the turning point? What brought it crashing down?
Well, according to the accounts, that perhaps facade of Trump sort of diverging from Netanyahu came crashing down when Netanyahu successfully got Trump to drop bombs on Iran.
Right. Iran. Let's unpack that.
Yeah, the materials give some important context here. During the nuclear deal talks, the U.S. apparently adopted the Israeli talking point of zero enrichment.
Zero enrichment.
Which for Iran is a non-starter. They're allowed to enrich uranium for civilian use under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So as soon as the U.S. team took that stance, talks basically stalled.
Okay.
Trump, reportedly getting impatient, then got a suggestion from the Israelis. Bomb them a little, to soften them up.
Bomb them a little.
That's the phrase used. And Trump apparently greenlit it, which notably included sending 300 Hellfire missiles to Israel specifically for use on Iran just before their June 13th attack.
That's quite specific. The missile transfer? And what about the public story around this bombing? Was U.S. involvement acknowledged?
Not at first, no. That's another interesting part. Initially, both the State Department and the Pentagon denied any U.S. involvement in Israel's bombing.
Denials, okay.
But then the narrative shifted pretty dramatically. As Trump apparently saw how well the bombing was playing on Fox News, he wanted this glory for himself and started indicating U.S. involvement. It really highlights this fascinating, maybe cynical interplay between military action, media coverage, and political gain.
Yeah.
And, of course, the U.S. is inherently involved anyway, right, since it provides the vast majority of their weapons. So claims of non-involvement are always complicated.
That's a really insightful look behind the curtain, the political math involved. Now let's shift focus back home. The domestic impact, public reaction to all these foreign policy moves.
Right.
After everything we've discussed, what really stands out to you in terms of public opinion, political pressure here?
Well, it raises this important question about public pushback. And what we seem to be seeing now is very significant pushback, quite different perhaps from past conflicts like the lead up to the Iraq War. Back then, there was this, widespread narrative, false as it turned out, but it managed to get broad support. Today, though, there seems to be notable, maybe even surprising, bipartisan opposition, like no new wars.
Bipartisan, really?
Yeah, the materials mention figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, both Republicans alongside Ro Khanna, a Democrat. They introduced a war powers resolution in the House. That's a tool to limit the president's power to commit troops without Congress signing off.
Okay.
And Senator Tim Kaine introduced a similar bill in the Senate. It reflects this growing feeling across the political divide, demanding more accountability, maybe a shift in foreign policy.
So it's not just one side of the aisle, it's broader.
Seems to be.
And how is this actually affecting votes, political choices for the current administration? Is it making a difference?
Well, we're seeing what looks like a clear link between these foreign policy decisions and voter turnout, which is, a powerful message. There's been a noted decline in turnout for the current administration. And one really striking statistic mentioned was that 29% of voters who'd previously backed Biden but didn't vote for Harris in a later election, they cited their main issue was Gaza.
Wow, 29% of that group.
Exactly. It suggests this isn't just symbolic protest votes. It implies these foreign policy decisions are having a real, tangible impact on voters' choices, their engagement. For a significant chunk of the electorate, Gaza isn't some distant issue. It's become a defining one.
It's really hard to talk about any of this without just acknowledging the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Yeah.
It's deeply disturbing. Feels like this constant, relentless weight.
It truly is. And the accounts we looked at point to the cumulative nature of the violence and maybe a profound shift in how it's even perceived.
Cumulative? How do you mean?
Well, people might remember that first hospital attack, October 17th. There was a narrative then, maybe it was a misfired rocket, the implication being Israel wouldn't strike a hospital. But then, when that didn't cause a huge global reaction, there were more hospital hits. The killing of the World Central Kitchen workers, that got huge attention too.
Yes, I remember that clearly.
But over time, the materials suggest it all just starts to get normalized.
Normalized, that's a chilling word.
It is, and it points to this maybe chilling insight into our collective awareness. How quickly truly shocking crises can just fade into the background noise. This cumulative violence, it seems, leads to a kind of desensitization, where immense suffering no longer registers in the mainstream media in the same way. And tragically, that contributes to this widespread despair and the dehumanization of Palestinians.
That's a really stark observation. But despite that normalization trend, are there any, glimmers of hope, signs of opinions shifting, maybe on the global stage?
Absolutely. Despite that normalization, there are signs of shifting views and really significant international efforts starting to brew, trying to impose some accountability. We've seen public figures like Piers Morgan, who defended actions for a long time, coming out against it. High-profile protests like performers at Glastonbury getting a lot of attention.
Right.
But maybe more importantly, globally, we're seeing these concerted attempts to actually act. There was a UN conference on Palestine planned, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. It got postponed by attacks, hasn't been rescheduled yet.
Okay.
But in the meantime, this AJ group, that's the Humanitarian Emergency in Gaza group, co-chaired by South Africa and Colombia, includes countries like Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia. They're meeting in Bogota, actively trying to figure out how to impose some degree of consequences on Israel.
Interesting. So action from maybe less expected quarters.
Exactly. And Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, she's calling for all countries to get involved in imposing consequences.
So it's not just talk then. There's some real diplomatic, political energy building, even if it's not from the usual big powers leading the charge. What's the bigger picture here? What does this mean for global norms, the rule of law?
Well, the documents we reviewed draw this really crucial parallel. Global condemnation of apartheid South Africa. It didn't start with the U.S. or the U.K.
Right.
It started with other nations. Nations who understood that allowing that kind of impunity, well, it undermines the fabric of international law for all of us.
That makes sense.
The core insight seems to be, if one country gets away with violating international law, just complete impunity, it sets a really dangerous precedent. It starts to erode the very foundations of the global order, the principles meant to protect everyone. So these efforts, even from smaller nations, they're critical. They're effectively trying to defend that fabric of international law before it tears apart completely.
So wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you, the listener? We really tried to synthesize this complex web: policy, influence, public reaction, international efforts. It's clear how intricate these global issues are and how they get shaped, how they're perceived. As you reflect on this, maybe consider how these decisions, often made by just a few people, really echo across the globe, how they impact public opinion, maybe even future political landscapes.
And maybe something for you to mull over is this: that ongoing global push for accountability, even coming from smaller nations, it signals a really critical moment for international norms, for the future of how the world governs itself.
Yeah.
It poses that profound question, doesn't it? How did the world respond when the very fabric of international law seems to be tearing? And what responsibility does that put on us as individuals to act, or maybe just to remain aware?
And as you think about that, maybe consider what actions, big or small, might help shift that tide, that normalization and despair we talked about. These challenges are definitely ongoing, and just staying aware is vital. For more insights like this, more in-depth analysis, be sure to look for and subscribe to Geopolitics